This is my first time doing tutorials, so I'm not really sure how I should approach this or what I should be calling this. So about a month ago, Xaron and I worked on this remix of Aries Conversations. It's heavily inspired by Jaron, still a really talented future-based artist. And we decided to show you guys some of our sound designs and mixing, and hopefully you can learn something from it. Just in case you haven't listened to the full track yet, I'll put a link in the description. Head there and give it a listen and let us know what you think. It might not be what you're looking for, it's fine, just close this video so we don't waste your time. But with that said, let's jump right into it. So I want to first talk about how I made these pads. They actually laid down the foundation for the entire track, so they are really important. To make them, I started with these 3 layers. So as you can hear, the pad originally sounds really basic. The first layer is simply the original vocals with tons of delays and reverbs on it. The other 2 layers are a bass and a saw pad I made in Xaron. So after putting them together, I bounce it into audio and put it in a granulator, which is a granular synth in Ableton. And then I mess with some of the knobs, some automations, and I bounce it to audio again. And here's what we have. Now the pads sound really nice, really unique, but one thing here is they kind of lack definition, which means you can't really tell the chords they are playing. So to fix that problem, I added 2 bass layers underneath. One is a bass, the other one is a sub bass, just to keep the lower frequencies completely clean. So here's how they sound like. Here's how they sound like in the first drop. There's this one trick I really like to use, and that is to layer cymbals on top of kicks, like a ride or simply a crash. And here's how I've done it. This is to help the kick stand out without overly exaggerating its high end. For a comparison, I'll play the drop with and without the cymbals. Here's how the drop sounds like without the cymbals. And here's how they sound like with the cymbals. As you can hear, the cymbals really help the kick punch through, and it also fills out the frequency spectrum, making the drop feels richer and fuller sounding. Moving on to the chord stacks, here's how they sound like. As you can see, I've added these 2 pad layers. They are actually the pads from the intro. I simply resampled them again and processed them differently, and here's how they sound like. And I layered these pads with some supersaws. Xaron actually made all the supersauce layers, so props to him. And here's what they sound like. So there are like 6 layers of supersauce and 2 layers of super squares. So that's a lot of layers. but personally think you can recreate something similar using 2 to 3 layers of Xaron only. One tip to make your Chordstack sound richer and fuller is to make it cover as much of the frequency spectrum as possible. So you can have different layers covering different frequency ranges by using EQ, or simply have different layers playing at different octaves so it covers more notes. One trick I really like to use to smooth out the transition in between chords and also to make the chords flow better is to use reverse reverb. So basically when a chord stops playing, you introduce this reverb signal and have it slowly coming up, leading to the next chord. And to create this effect, you need two things. One is a reverb plugin, the other one is a gain control plugin. In Ableton, you can use utility. The utility plugin is for volume automations. I tend not to do volume automations on the volume fader because if you have automations on it, it would be really inconvenient to mess with the overall volume control. Basically, to create this effect, you set your reverb at 100% wet, and then you use your utility plugin to pull back the gain or volume every time a chord stops playing. And you slowly bring it back up, leading to the next chord. And for comparison, here's with and without the effect. So now let's talk about the bass. Here's how each of the layers sounds like. So as you can hear, the way we layer those basses is pretty similar to how we layered those supersaws. The only thing different here is that all these layers are playing in the same octave. As for our EQ settings, each of the layers have different EQ settings. For the one we are looking at right now, since it focuses more in the mid frequencies, we cut out the very lows and the very highs. This one focuses more in the high mids, and this one has more content in the 10 to 15K range. One thing to notice here is that instead of using high cut filters to cut out high frequencies, we went for high shelf filters. We found out that shelf filters tend to be more transparent sounding, so even you pull it way down, it won't completely remove the high end, which makes it easier for us when we try to layer or blend certain sounds together. And here's how it sounds like when I switch to the high cut filters. As you can hear, once I switch to the high cut filters, they just sound super muffled. Another tip for EQing basses is to leave the very low frequencies for the sub bass only. So for those upper layers, you remove everything under about 100 Hz. So you can keep the very low frequencies completely clean. This is because we tend to distort and add a lot of processing in the upper layers. So without treating it, it will make things sound really muddy and also messy in the low end. But if you still want some warmth or like grittiness in the very low end, you can always apply some gentle saturation on the sub bass. But anyway, here's how the basses sound like altogether. So I started with this synth layer I made in Xaron. Here's how it sounds like. So as you can see, there's only one LFO modulating the FM value, and the rest are just a reverb filter and some really basic processing in Xaron. And to make it sound more interesting and give it some texture, I added some authentic instrument sounds. For example, here I added some marimbas for transient and to make it sound more plucky. And to give it some sparkles in the high end, I also added this flute layer, and here's how it sounds like. And lastly, Xaron also added this electric guitar sound from Ableton, just to give it some interesting texture and tone. And here's how the lead sounds like all together. As to how we came up with these layers, we can't really tell you because it all comes down to trial and error. But there are a few things you could try. So for example, if you need more transient, then maybe go for something like a marimba, a bell, or simply anything plucky. But if you need more sparkles in the high end, then maybe pick a wind instrument, so maybe like a flute, a piccolo, or simply pick a white noise. Don't be afraid of experimenting, so just try mix and match different sounds together, see what works, what doesn't, and you'll eventually get there. So moving on to the second drop, it's actually the exact copy of the first one. The only thing different here is I added this new lead layer on top, and here's how it sounds like. As you can hear, I've also done the reverse reverb trick, but this time I've done it differently. Here I went for Valhalla room and auto filter. So instead of doing the volume automation, what we are doing here is I automated the mix value on the Valhalla room. So whenever I need a reverb signal, I simply bring up the mix value on my reverb. And to keep things clean in the low end, whenever there's a reverb signal, the auto filter will move up, cutting out the very low frequencies. One thing to make your lead sound more interesting is to avoid using only one single layer for the entire drop. So here I actually have two leads playing in turns. So here's the first one. And here's the other layer. So basically they are doing this call and response thing and playing in turns. And by doing so, it gives the lead line more movement and makes it less static and less boring. Another trick to give your lead line more movement is to add pitch modulation to it. Here I added some pitch bend every 8 bars and some vibrato in the long notes. So here's how they sound like. You could also add some portamento just to create some pitch bend effect at the start of every few notes. And for the final drop, it's quite different from the first two, and it's heavily inspired by Jaron's Bring Me Home, which sounds something like this. So we started by putting down a kick and a cymbal on every single beat. You might be able to notice this kick is actually the exact same one we used in the first two drops. The only difference here is we added a top layer over it, but without that layer, in the drop it sounds something like this. At the moment, the kick is not punching through at all. That's why we added that top kick layer and filtered out some of its low and mid frequencies, just so it won't clash with the original kick. After that, we worked on the group processing by applying some saturation and distortion using Decapitator and used the glue compressor to soft clip the drums a little bit. And here's the final result. So one thing we added in the final drop is this vocal layer. Many people asked us how we brought everything up a notch in the final drop. But to be honest, there wasn't anything special going on. It was just the vocal layer and also the drums doing the job. To make that vocal layer, we simply reversed the vocals, time stretched it, pitched it up, and applied tons of delays and reverbs, and that's it. To prove that, we removed the vocal layers, and here's how it sounds. As you can hear, things sound really bland, and this is because without the vocal layers, there's nothing driving the whole drop forward. Since Xaron and I are both a huge fan of Jaron, we took some inspiration from his track Venture and created some guitar sounds, guitar ambiences. Here's how they sound like. We've also recorded some guitar chords in the build-up. And the final drop as well. And here I actually made a riser out of a guitar. So here's what the guitar originally sounds like without any processing. What you want to do next is to heavily distort the sound. Then you put on some reverb. And finally distort it again. And yeah, that's how you create the signature Jaron sound.